We're going to start with a montage to introduce the next topic, which is the players.
I would say it is probably a big challenge for any entrepreneur to assemble a good team. And essentially, I would say the most important asset of any company are the people.
Every person has certain strengths and weaknesses. And I think you have to understand yourself and understand what you need. So if you're an optimistic person, you need a pessimistic person. If you're good in science, you need someone on the team who's good in finance. You know, if you're really good at pitching, but you're not very good at making sure all the bills are paid on time, I mean, you need all the pieces in place.
When you are putting together a business where the primary asset is the creativity and the intelligence of the people who are a part of that business, I feel in some ways that you're putting together a number of artists. You know, so you do have strong personalities, strong intuition, strong desires. And sure enough, those were people that we had to replace because they never really get comfortable to the idea that we had to work as a team.
When you're dealing with Apple or IBM or Microsoft, one bad person doesn't have a huge effect on the overall culture. When you have 5 people sitting in a tiny room, one person is 20%.
There are a lot of good scientists out there, a lot of good technical experts. If you cannot connect very well with people at different levels, with different backgrounds, doing a startup is going to be very, very difficult.
People who've worked together in various combinations is also important. It's something that is important for you as an entrepreneur. It's something also that potential investors and customers look for. Are these people who can work well together?
You have to have people who are good at optimizing things. You also need people who are going to be quite aggressive in pushing new approaches and new technologies and so on and so forth, and getting answers for certain things, and you need those as well. Then you've got people who are really quite entrepreneurial. They want to grow their own companies. They make it very clear they want to grow their own companies.
If something was new to us, we found a lot of comfort in bringing in someone who had a very thick resume and had done it a million times. And logically, that does seem like it should be useful, and sometimes it is. But I find it interesting that through our whole history of PTC, our most successful efforts have been led by people who have never done it before.
Why do you need junior and senior titles in your startup? You don't. You're rowing a boat all the same direction, right? So focus on the task and solving the problem and let the culture start to form. You probably don't need a CFO or a CMO or a CTO or a COO. What you need is a group of people that are busting their tail to get something done. Doesn't matter what their titles are. They're going to earn their titles.
I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I believe all my ideas are fantastic, and most of them aren't. And only by talking and reflecting off of other people early on will anybody get some honest feedback about, you know, the idea they have may not be great, but a parallel idea that's really just adjacent could be a winner.
Get the list of people you're listening to down to a group of people that you trust, that are passionate. You can't be one of 30 startups that they're working with. Like, they've got to care about this, you know, nearly as much as you do.
They're probably going to give you a very rapid, unvarnished answer, which may sometimes be uncomfortable, but it's usually pretty valuable.
If someone's truly vested in helping you at the company, it doesn't start by saying, well, give me a percentage of the company and then I'll help you. You should meet people in the ecosystem that provide value, if they continue to provide value, and they continue to fit with where your company goes. You know, one of the things I really struggle with is I see companies who pivot or change or do whatever they need to do as they refine their business model, but their mentors aren't changing, their advisors aren't changing. Is this a great idea by a great team solving a meaningful problem with a real business model? So your advisors and your mentors, if they're not helping you with one of those 4 things, if they're not fundamentally the best in one of those things, they're the wrong people to be working with. And it's okay to say, I want to upgrade my mentor.
So our next speaker is Jennifer Hill. She's a venture lawyer, and she spends a lot of time helping people like yourself get their companies running, raising money, dealing with things such as monetizing intellectual property and completing mergers and acquisitions. She's also very active in the entrepreneurial community. You may see her on MSNBC and CBS, Money Watch. She blogs a lot on Huffington Post. And she's also one of the founders of the New York's office for Astia. I am extremely grateful for Jennifer to be here. When you first start to put these things together, you start with this. a blank sheet. So you're first engaging people, ask them, hey, do you want to come and be part of this event and speak? She said yes. And not only did she say yes, she was very helpful in actually bringing a lot of the talented folks that are here today with us. So thank you, Jennifer, and please come up to stage.
Well, good morning. I am delighted to be here today, and particularly delighted to be discussing this segment with you, and then in just a few short moments introducing our panelists. The topic of this session is the players. Now, aside from having a fantastic team and a great technology, product, and a vision, and the ability to execute, there's a whole other cast of characters that are totally integral into building a successful company, and that's what the purpose of the players is all about. We're going to introduce you to some of these different categories, talk about the different people that you're going to find in the life of your startup. You may be looking for them now. You may be looking for them between breaks and on lunch hours in this very room. And so we want to help you do this better and get the color and feedback from our panelists who have done this a number of times before, give you some tips and some best practices for dealing with all the different folks that will come in and out of your startup, and ultimately figure out to have them help you become more successful. So in my role as an attorney, and frankly in my previous life to that, working at startups, you find that these people change over time all the time. And while you may have your own game plan that you're really working on, and you may have some big names that you just absolutely want to have on your team, what you're soon going to realize is that those are great, but it's really about the people who are dedicated to you and your vision and are going to find you everyone you need and every resource to help make your company successful. So as a quick introduction, here are the players. This is a fairly extensive list, but by no means an exhaustive list, and depending on which particular area that you're focused on, whether it's therapeutics, whether it's digital health, some of these may change. But the first and foremost piece, of course, is your team. You may just start with an idea, you may start with a co-founder, but very soon that's going to grow into employees, into consultants, into a whole other set of folks. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that. The second piece are your advisors. And one thing that Geoff touched on very well in the video is that there are people that are often interested in only doing this for a piece of your company. There are people that you may want to pick their brain, and doing that may actually be 5 minutes, and it may end there. And then there are people that you may want to actually have involved with you throughout the entire life of your startup. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to differentiate who's a mentor, who's an advisor, and then who's really someone who's committed to your team over the long haul. And then, of course, how those people change just as your company and your team changes. Part of that is also a scientific advisory board. We are going to talk a little bit, of course, about one of the most important pieces, which are your users. That's something that you're hearing over and over again, is that while you're ideating in a lab or at a university, or you may still be at a company doing this, if you're not connecting to your users, you're missing an extremely important part of the equation. They're a critical part of your team. We'll talk a little bit about strategic partners. Particularly in this space, strategic partners are some of the first things that you're thinking about. Oh, I want to go sell this to this big pharmaceutical company or that big medical device manufacturer. There's a whole lot of people aside from the Fortune 500 companies. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you engage them, when you engage them, and making some smart decisions around that. We'll talk about lawyers and accountants, which are a functional standpoint and personal bias aside. They can help you to make some really smart decisions in terms of setting up your company, divvying out equity, figuring out how to develop a funding strategy, protect and monetize your intellectual property, all those kinds of things. We'll speak a little bit about regulatory and when to approach that. And last, but certainly not least, we will talk about funding sources. One of the things that I always hear entrepreneurs talk about, regardless of the industry that they're in or their stage of the company, is that they say, I could just do that if I had money, and money is my biggest problem. Money is never the biggest problem in a startup company. But one of the single biggest places where entrepreneurs will waste a lot of time is spending time going after the wrong funding sources at the improper stage of the company's life cycle. So we're going to talk about a little bit about some of the funding sources that are available depending on where you are. These may be research grants, these may be university grants, or frankly, private sector grants. These could be angel investors, venture capitalists, maybe someday when you're looking to raise 20 or 30 million, private equity. So we've got a lot of stuff to cover today. And without further ado, I am delighted to introduce my panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Sofie Qiao, who's the co-founder and president of Link Pharmaceuticals. She's the founding president of Lead Therapeutics, and she consults and advises with a number of startups. Next, we have Geoff Clapp, who's the founder of the Health Hero Network. He's a serial entrepreneur, and many of you may know him already as he's very involved with Rock Health. We have Avi Roop, the CEO of Miret Surgical. And last, we have Nick Franano, the CEO of Novita Therapeutics. Please come up. Welcome. You're now in the hot seat. So with all these things in mind, there's a whole list of folks out there, but let's get back to basics. You're either an early entrepreneur, or maybe you're just sitting in your kitchen and you've come up with an idea. What is the first thing that you do? Where do you start? Avi.
I think one of the most important things to think about is differentiating in medical devices between an observed issue, observed event in the hospital, versus a problem that potentially physicians or proceduralists have, versus a true unmet clinical need. And being able to articulate and differentiate all of those really requires time with the user. And so I would argue the first thing I do is bounce these ideas off of a physician, off of a surgeon, off of a proceduralist.
Geoff.
Well, the first observation I want to make is at a life sciences conference, you start in the kitchen, but at technology, when you start in the garage. So it's fantastic you guys have upgraded. That's fantastic. Obviously, I've moved the right direction. I think the most important thing is actually, I agree with everything Avi said, but Steve already said it earlier this morning, is you got to get out of that kitchen and build something. It's just too easy not to build something. I don't care if it's a prototype. I don't care if it's a piece of paper. Get out and talk to people and show people things. The worst behavior I see in every entrepreneur is they think they've figured out something that no one else in the world has ever figured out, and God forbid they say something at Starbucks, someone's going to overhear them and go build it. And that's simply ridiculous, even in San Francisco.
This is one for all our panelists. Nick.
I think, as a physician and a scientist, the first place I stop is the library, and I spend a good week really digging deep into the problem to see if there's a product opportunity and a company opportunity there. And then the second place I stop is my kitchen table with my family, because I do think if you're going to leave your job as a physician or a scientist and you're going to start a startup company to develop that, it's an important kitchen table conversation. And if you don't have your spouse or your family really behind you, I mean, it makes it really difficult to make it over the long term. That really, when you think about team, your spouse, your partner, your family is really your first team. And they have to be on board at some level. They may not know all the details of it, where it's going to lead, but at least you've had the conversation. They were there on the landing, so if you crash, at least you asked them before you took off.
A very good point. Now, Sofie, your last company, you started in a little bit of a different way because it really started with a concept. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So my last company was called Lead Therapeutics. It was a pure business model play in the sense that I just formulated a business plan, incorporated a company in my home address in San Diego, and then used that business plan to assemble a full management team ready to go. And then we together raised Series A financing within a few months. So I would say I do concur with the rest of the panelists in the sense that when you first have an idea, you really have to bounce it off. In the sense that I've seen too many entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs, they tell me that they would like to work on something because they really don't want to work for another company and they think they're underappreciated and so on. I would say I think of it in a different way in the sense that if you actually think this idea is worth doing, by, of course, talking to a lot of people, you realize this is worth doing. Second question is, are you the best person to go about doing it? That would be the only two questions to answer, not because you're unhappy with your job, because you may be very unhappy with a lot of the hurdles and heartaches and headaches that you have to encounter as an entrepreneur. I would say no money actually would be enough to justify the heartaches and the headaches that one entrepreneur has to go through. So, but in my experience, I would say yes, bouncing the idea off other people and then assemble a team that can actually work with you to achieve this vision. I think that's the that would be the first step to take.
I want to touch on something you said, which is really being honest with yourself about whether you're ready to be an entrepreneur. I'm curious as to what some of the other panelists think about that, and do you really know? It's not necessarily something that you wake up in the morning and say, yes, I'm ready, and there's these 5 criteria, and I've got all of them. But how do you know, or do you just do it?
I think the first startup company I was able to be involved with was in the late 90s, and I was recruited as a young lad, and I really had no idea what was going on. And so it was a trial by fire, and it turned out to be successful. Then working for a large corporation for 9 years, and then leaving that to go back to entrepreneurship, I had a lot of anxiety and fear about pulling away that safety blanket. I think that being able to be involved with something that provides some bridge in terms of that safety blanket, whether it's a fellowship or some sort of graduate type experience where you can have a little bit of income that can tide you over, is really crucial to dealing with all of that fear and anxiety.
Jeff?
Okay. You're never ready. I mean, you're not ready the second time, you're not ready the third time, you're not ready the fourth time. We love to the last 5 years, we've seen startup culture turn into this storytelling, right? My grandfather told the same story. He walked uphill both ways to school in the snow, right? It's hard, it's so difficult, the FDA, the this, the that. I mean, we love to say it's hard. We love to put up these burdens because we want to self-validate what we're doing. And we also want to self-validate failure, which most of us will fail, at least once. So what? But I think the problem is that right now, there's the idea that either, are you totally going to be ready? No. You got to get started. I mean, you're sitting in the best place in the world to fail, but just keep going. But the idea that we're going to turn this into, are you ready? Yeah, it's hard. So is a lot of other things. So is working for big companies. It's hard everywhere. It's how easy are you going to make it? So I think the big thing is, if you have the emotional intelligence and you believe in something enough, I don't care if you're smart enough, I care if you're passionate enough. If you can actually weather the storm emotionally, great, go for it. But you should go for it no matter what, because one of them's going to fail. I don't know if it's the first one or your last one, but nobody's 100% successful. Nobody.
Yeah, I just want to add, I totally agree in the sense that it's like having a kid. How can you be totally ready? By the time you're totally ready, you're probably, too late to have a kid.
I can relate to that. How important is business model? So Sofie, you started your business with a concept of just a model and then went from there. But a lot of other companies, they come up with an idea and they have no idea about the business model. So I'm gonna ask this question to you, Nick. How important is the business model, and to have that right off the bat?
So it depends on what you define as the business model. What we saw in the earlier panel for my company, my first company, Proteon Therapeutics, it's a protein drug against a new protein drug against a novel target for an untreatable disease from a company outside of the normal geography that needs $100 million in 10 years to reach an exit. So when I talk to people about that this is what I want to do, I got a lot of good luck with that. Where people just said, look, this is just too big of a rock to roll up the hill. You can't do it. And as an entrepreneur, I didn't love hearing that. But at the end of the day, it didn't scare me off. People say medical school's hard. People say residency's hard. People say fellowship's hard. Lots of things are hard. Raising children's hard. So it didn't scare me off. But for therapeutics, it's a different business model. I had a very simple business model when we started. We had a great drug that we understood how we were going to use it, and we were going to raise $50 million, take it into phase 2, and sell it to a pharma company for $500 million. I didn't need I was never going to go public. I never thought we'd go public. I never thought we'd build a fully integrated pharmaceutical company. We were a single product focused company for a very important disease with a very interesting therapeutic that was just to phase 2 and then sell. And essentially that's what we've done. And now it was $74 million instead of $50 in capital. And the exit was $550 million instead of $500. But I'm one of those rare examples where in the very beginning we had a simpleton business plan of 10 steps, and it actually kind of worked out. So that was kind of our business plan. It was a pared down view. We never thought we would do the whole thing, and that simplified it. It became kind of a business that was a project to an exit, which I think in 2001 was not as attractive to investors, but I think right now that capital efficient, focused, clear exit with a corporate partner kind of business model in life sciences, I think is better now, more appreciated now.
I think I'd agree. It's difficult to know. I feel like the setup of the company, so two that I work on right now are these lean strategies, ultra lean, or maybe an inability to raise a lot of money, lean. But the business model, going into it, but at least going into it knowing that it's going to be on the small side. This is not something that we're going to have $1 billion exit. It defines the early culture of the team and how the team's compensated and how the team works together. And I think that's important because everyone needs to be at least oriented to and calibrated to what does the general trail look like? What's the general path of the business model going to be? But it's difficult to say. We locked it in and we executed exactly every single line in the plan.
So I think it's unbelievably important to think about. You're not going to be right. So when you talk about your business model, as the Rock Health startups that are here will tell you, and all the time that I spend with them, we spend a lot of time on this concept, not because they're going to be right, because they haven't sold anything. I mean, some of them don't have revenue yet, some of them have, some of them haven't, but I want to see that they're thinking about it. And I say this to someone, and let me try to put my money where my mouth is. So we built the biggest remote patient monitoring company in the world and then sold it off. And very successful, and I tell that part of the story. What I don't tell you is that when we first started that company, I would walk into hospitals and have slides that talked about reducing bed days of care, which meant I got immediately kicked out. So not really understanding your customers and your business model and thinking through those things, I want to get it into the intellectual dialogue of the entrepreneur. You're not going to be right. Your business model is going to evolve. Whatever you wrote down the first time won't be right. But you have to think about it. It needs to be part of the process. The worst thing that happened between 1997 and 2001 was freemium, which was an excuse for, goddamn, I don't know, right? So the idea that you're thinking about it, that you're building something up is what I want to see in entrepreneurs, because I did it wrong. I mean, I'm not going to stand here and preach as if I got it right. I got it totally wrong. And I wish I had done that. I wish I had someone pushing me to think about the business model from the very start rather than going in and saying stupid things to hospitals like I did. So.
Let's move on a little bit to building your team and how everyone did that. So if you talk about your model that you did with your last company and how you actually went about building your team, because the company just started with you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the concept of lead therapeutics was really to leverage the best of the United States and China to do discovery, meaning my goal was to actually create a US-China hybrid business model, discovery company, and also to demonstrate to investors that discovery can be an NPV positive activity in the sense that we will build this company and exit at preclinical stage so that they won't say, well, if we have to exit, we have to wait until phase 2, then why do we bother starting a discovery company? So that is really a concept. And so, of course, around that concept, I needed to access industry veterans, chemistry, biology, or clinical, those who actually have shepherded programs throughout the entire, pipeline, such as, people who actually have been through big pharma and biotech and leading companies' discovery and development programs. So I was in business development before, and therefore I had a lot of contacts and went around talking to people, bouncing off the idea, and then recruiting people. I would say one thing I learned from recruiting people, and I assembled an entire management team ready to go by the time we went out to raise Series A financing. We eventually raised a Series A of $17 million after a few months of effort. I would say one thing I learned is that this is something I was taught by someone else. Greed and ego kill companies. Meaning you could actually start with a great business model, great concept, great technology, but greed and ego do kill companies. And funny, ironically, without greed or ego, or without a certain amount of it, you would never be an entrepreneur. So that's why it's really important to keep that in check. And that's how you can actually assemble a team around you. Because if you have too much greed and too much ego, no one is willing to actually follow. No one is willing to assemble around you. And that's why I always, after my entrepreneurial experience, I always think that I've truly endorsed what F. Scott Fitzgerald once said. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to keep two seemingly opposing thoughts at the same time and still be able to function. Meaning, as an entrepreneur, you want to be passionate, but you also want to be emotionless at times. When it's, you want to be perseverant, but you don't want to be tone deaf when other people are telling you something different that you don't want to hear. And you really, really want to be kind of greedy and egocentric because that's how you can push your idea through. But then you definitely don't want to actually have that showcase in front of your team because they will actually leave at the first second they see it. So that's my 2 cents.
So we started in 1998. So the way we recruited great people is we added the word network to the end of our name and told everyone we were an IPO. And everybody came and wanted to work for us, the first batch. But then, like everybody else, we went through the bubble and had to survive that. And so maybe I will focus the question on how did we actually build up that core team. One of the things we did when people joined the company is we actually handed them a picture of who the people were that we served. They were 50 plus, chronic disease sufferers, and thinking about how we're improving their lives and trying to make sure that those people were able to connect with that. Because there were days where we didn't always make payroll. There were days where we didn't always keep the server running. There were days when people didn't go home. And now I'm telling all those uphill stories that I said I wasn't going to tell. That the reality is that if you're not passionate and totally wedded to what you're trying to do and how you build the team and that people actually care, I don't need a good iOS engineer. I need somebody who actually cares about chronic care. And so I think that what we saw is when we built up the team, we could make people who care about chronic care great iOS engineers. It's really hard to find great iOS engineers that you can make care about the 50 plus market, about chronic care, about CHF, about nurse efficiency, about all of these things. And I think that when you think about building your team, I found that the best way to do that, and I found that that actually changed after the acquisition, to be quite honest, is that you don't hire to skills. You hire to passion and people that you believe can get to those skills, especially in engineering and marketing and all these areas where you have to, there's expertise. You know what? They were experts in something else in their last job, right? Programming languages change. All of those things change. You don't need the best iOS engineer. You need the best person who's passionate about what you're trying to accomplish.
So one of the things that we hear a lot of entrepreneurs saying, particularly those that are commercializing out of a university, is you need someone with a lot of experience on your team or someone who has domain knowledge in that area. So how do you comport what you've just said, which are all valid and obviously tools for becoming successful, but how do you comport that with, you need someone really experienced, and how do you get that VP or that ex-CMO of a medical device company on your team? Or do you not even bother? Avi?
I think the first two people that we worked with were people that we had personal relationships with. So I'm going to key in on the personal relationship component. I think that that's absolutely crucial for the early stage, because you need to understand that there's a relationship beyond what the actual work you're trying to do, because that's one way that helps me at least selfishly trust that I'm going to get honest feedback. And those personal relationships were with a professional investor and with a surgeon. We were making general surgical tools. Those two individuals who we had a personal relationship with were the access point for us to the rest of the world, and that they could vouch for the technology, but really they could vouch for us as passionate, intelligent people. And once Dr. Fabulous and Mr. Rich Guy say, hey, this, Avi's okay, then the doors open much easier. But it wasn't without that personal relationship that would show through in the introductions. I don't think we would have been able to get to where we are now.
I would say that it's really important to actually find such people to be on your team, because drug discovery and development, for example, that's my field. It's a really, I would say, experience-heavy field, in the sense that unless you have decades of experience, you don't really know actually how something actually really could pan out. And of course, even then, even if you have decades of experience, things could happen. So, and then the idea of a new entrepreneur accessing such people, for example, I recruited a CSO who was former head of discovery research at Warner Lambert Park Davis, and then later on head of R&D at Onyx Pharmaceuticals in shepherding Nexavar throughout the partnership with Bayer. And I think from talking to him, I realized that really there are people around who have such experience, like 20 or 30 years of experience, and then they are interested only if they think that this idea could work and they could actually work with you. Those are the two criteria, and you must demonstrate these two things to these people who have many choices out there, aside from working with you on a startup company.
I think when you build a team, after your family is with you and understanding what you're doing, I think the next part of the team is your co-founders. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that is your initial core team that gets the technology going. And when I think about that, I think of the idea is you want to make a square out of different pieces that are, in various places around you. And different people have different shapes, and you just want to put those shapes together so that you can make a square. And so the first thing as the founder is to be aware of what your own strengths and weaknesses are, and to realize that for your weaknesses, you're going to need to bring in people either from a skill set or from a personality set or from an energy or that balance you, because there is no single person that can manage such a complex organization. And so you have to realize and empower people to do the pieces that they do well. And so when I went and got my co-founder, I'm a physician and a scientist and someone who sees opportunity clearly. And my co-founder, and I was 33, my co-founder was 63 and was a lawyer with finance and accounting experience who sees risk. And so the two of us made a good partnership because he would be frustrated that I would bring him a new opportunity, and so he was my filter. And so I had, in order for us to go forward with a major project or a hire or something that was important, I would have to get past his filter. And so sometimes I couldn't get past it, where I would go, you know what, he's right, we shouldn't do this. We can't do everything we think of. And sometimes he would, I would convince him that this is mission critical for the company. And so, and being different generations allowed us to be collaborative without being competitive. And so we made a very good initial strong partnership. And I think I was able to provide him interesting opportunities and confidence in what we were developing. And he managed all the money, kept all the legal arrangements in order, and was a filter for the things we really shouldn't do that I thought of over the weekend.
So really quickly, I would say that if I was experienced when we started the company, I would have been smart enough not to try to tackle that problem. So I think there's an ignorance, a blissful ignorance that comes with this, and don't confuse experience for doing it the same way over and over and over again. The challenge for anyone who's done it once, and I'll be very honest, I struggle with this since we exited the company, is to not be a storyteller, to not be, well, this is how we've done it before. Innovation doesn't happen in a box, and innovation certainly does not happen telling stories about the past. And one of the reasons I volunteer my time at Rock Health as much as I do is because they keep me, those startups and those people, that's the experience I want to leverage. The reason I work with startups is because that's where I want to stay and mentally. So not only do I think that gaining experience through building your team is really important, but don't confuse experience with like, oh, I've got to go get someone smarter than me, because that's baloney. If that's the nicest word I think I can use on the panel. So I'd say a much more aggressive word, because I really believe this, that you don't confuse experience. In fact, the onus is on those of us who have done it 1, 2, 3, 4 times to keep letting those people inspire us as much as vice versa. Experience is the past. Innovation is the future.
Let's talk a little bit about virtual companies, because as we all know, it's very common and much easier now to have your team spread across the country or spread across the world. How has that factored in, or how do you think it's going to continue to factor into startups? Is it good or bad? Is there no judgment? How do you think it looks in the eyes of potential customers, partners, or investors?
So I think that's a huge issue right now, is like any trend, it can be overdone. And so, we went from $30 million, $40 million Series A investments in teams of 30 to 40, 6 months into an initial investment, to now, this is a crazy story, but I, not too recently, but not too far in the past, pitched a venture capital group for our Series A at Proteon. I got all the way to a final meeting in a major American city, flew my team in, final partner meeting. They had an ex-commissioner of the FDA there, and I got a no. And then afterward, I got an email from the ex-FDA commissioners where I had pitched a $19 million plan to get initial clinical data. And I got an email back with an attachment and a note to me, friendly note, saying, what we'd really recommend is that you take, $1.5 million and then come back to us with a 20-patient clinical trial. And I thought, is this some kind of cruel joke? I thought, is this like a prank? Am I being punked here? Am I actually supposed to take $1.5 million? I couldn't even make my salt formulation for $1.5 million. And I didn't even reply, but it was an extreme example of they feel pressure for you to bring back clinical data for an amount of money that really is impossible. And you have to say no to that. You have to say, no, I won't try that. The patients deserve better. I'm not going to do it if I know I don't have money to even get halfway to where I need to be. So where we've settled is a small team, a small R&D lab, and a lot of external collaborators, and that's about as skinny as we can get. And I think when I go around, we did a potential early licensing opportunity before we did a venture financing. And when I went to these hyper virtual companies, and they would have 2 people in an office in San Diego somewhere, no lab, no company, and they'd say, oh, license your drug to us. Mm-hmm. And I would fly back home and think, why would I give my drug to them? There's no one there, right? I at least have an R&D lab. I'm flying back to my R&D lab, and I'm going to be doing research tomorrow. There's 2 guys in in an office building somewhere, they don't have any capability. So I don't think it shows well when it's two people in an office building somewhere, and that's a pharma company. It just doesn't seem right to me.
Now, Sophie, you ran your business in the U.S. and China, and a lot of it was virtual, and you relied a lot on consultants. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Actually, I just would like to facetiously answer the $1 million for phase 1 trial. Likely, those investors probably heard some pitch from Chinese companies saying we can do until phase 2 was $1 million. So you can definitely do $1.5 million for phase 1. So for lead therapeutics, actually, our intention at the beginning, that was in 2006, was to actually set up our own R&D center in China, but with a U.S. headquarters team, because we believe the experience of drug discovery resides here in the United States. So the headquarters, the core team, the thinking, or the brains are going to be here in the United States, the hands are going to be in China. But then after we raised money, we raised a Series A in 2007, in April 2007, our investors went to visit the Chinese CROs and then decided, okay, it's not a good idea for us to spend time building up our R&D center. Just do it with a CRO on a strategic collaboration, meaning we certainly do realize that arm's length relationship type of outsourcing is not going to do the work that's required for discovery. But we also don't want to spend the money and the time to build up an R&D center. So eventually we made a compromise. We had a small office. Again, it's just a small office of 2 people in Shanghai managing Xiang Pharma, which is the second largest discovery and preclinical CRO in China, managing the scientists directly on site in our dedicated space, dedicated scientists to lead therapeutics. And then that actually worked out fine in the sense that we delivered 2 preclinical candidates in 2 years. The company raised $17 million in 2007, exited up to $97 million in 2010. So in 3 years, we were able to actually return capital to the investors and demonstrate that discovery can be NPV positive with a virtual model. But I do think that the pure 2 people type of virtual model, I really do not think that will work. Even in our case, when we try to do in-licensing, meaning we wanted to in-license programs to complement our internal programs, we recognize that people look at our office and think, if you don't have an R&D center, we shouldn't be out-licensing programs to you. Fortunately, we were in the business of selling ourselves anyways, and that wasn't an issue. But I do think virtual play can only be applicable to certain type of activities, and brick and mortar structure has their advantages. Even in today's environment, when China cost is considered so much lower that one should always, everyone has been encouraged by the investors to go to China and to outsource to China discovery or clinical or so on. But there are certain activities that you must manage in-house, and then there are certain activities that cannot even be outsourced at all. That's my opinion.
Let's move a little bit over to funding, as you touched on in your capital raise, because it's always something that's on every entrepreneur's mind. There's a whole continuum of funding, and I know that's one of the topics that another panel is going to go into. So without in any way diving too deep into that, tell us a little bit about the relationships that you started building and where your first places are to go to funding. A lot of entrepreneurs often ask, who do I go to? Am I looking for an SBIR grant? Am I looking to go to an incubator and sit there for 3 months? Do I approach, my father's best friend's former roommate who runs a hedge fund who has money? Or do I actually go to a real life science angel group or even early stage venture capitalist? So what are some good tips that entrepreneurs can think about as they spend their time and they approach potential investors?
I think that pitching is crucial, and not being afraid to go to early on, go to large venture capitalists or anybody that will give you the time of day, because what they're going to do, what they have is they have insight at a much higher level to a much broader spectrum of invention and technology, and they're going to be able to give you very rapid feedback and very rapid guidance. And it took a while for me and our team to get comfortable with this, but really they don't have the time to steal anyone's ideas. They're really just going to give you that rapid feedback, and that's probably all the more time they're going to spend on it. That first step of going into that lion's den, if you will, and testing yourself is going to be very valuable. I think from there, they're going to give you feedback about whether or not you should be going to a small venture capitalist, whether you should be talking to one of their friends who'd be willing to give you $50,000, or whether you should really regroup, try to find some grant money and prove some basic science before you ever come talk to another investor.
I think representing more of a digital health approach to things, my answer might be a little bit different, and just in the spirit of kind of a little bit of disagreement on a panel is good. I think you do have to consider who you're pitching to. If I want to see entrepreneurs who have taken the due diligence to understand why they're talking to who they're talking to. And in that vein, they might not have the time to steal what you're going to do, or the skills. They're just taking a shot at the VCs in the room. So, but they have a fiduciary responsibility to the rest of their portfolio. And if you are doing something and you haven't taken the time to figure out what's in their portfolio, their fiduciary responsibility is to the rest of their team. So I have no problem with the VC going back to the people they've invested in and saying, hey, I just met with this company and they're doing some really innovative stuff and they're doing some things. And they're hot on your tail to motivate their current investment. That's part of their responsibility. That's what you want in one of your investors. I think especially in digital health, we haven't proven yet that there are VC level returns across the board. And there are very few high quality angel investors. But the barriers are very low to build great things. So it's much closer to kind of consumer internet and other products like that, other markets like that, where you should be going, you should be moving, you should be building. If your angel or seed or Series A isn't asking you about things like traction, about your engagement model, about how you're actually doing, you shouldn't be going into any kind of fundraising money with a PowerPoint deck. You should be showing, not telling. That's the current state of where we are, and we have a responsibility as an industry to start proving that we can get to VC level returns by doing, not talking.
So I think one of the things I learned very early from one of my key mentor relationships was to initially lay out the development plan for your products, and then to immediately superimpose on that a financing plan that fits with your development plan. Because otherwise your development plan is not credible without a plan to finance, and a plan to finance all the way through to your exit. And so when we went through that exercise, what was clear to me is there's sort of a start small and grow bigger, and then that funding a biotech company really can be, takes a village, a group of people. So the first thing we did was write our own checks to the company as founders, and I thought it was important for us to put some substantial part of our net worth into the company on day one to prove our commitment. And then we went out and got a group of angel investors, and when they committed, then we got a state investment fund to match that. So the state came in on a sort of eco-devo investment kind of approach. And then we raised some additional angel money. We got some NIH grants, which showed that the NIH was interested in what we were doing. And then we went to Venture A, early stage venture investors, and did a syndicate of 4, and then we went to a very large venture investor for B. And I thought that progression worked really well for us. And so, you start small. I think some of my colleagues back in 03, 04 who jumped right to a single large investor early in the process, I think in some ways it was easier, right? They didn't have to go on the road for a year. But going on the road for a year and pitching your Series A was an amazingly learning experience, like you mentioned. I learned so much. VCs and good investors see so many plans and so many pitfalls. They've seen so many crashes, like the FDA. The FDA gives great advice because they've seen all the problems. And they'll tell you, and VCs are not afraid to tell you, look, I've seen 10 companies fail trying to do what you're doing for all the following reasons. So for me, I think the single best pitch I did was when I had 3 of 4 VC commitments for our Series A syndicate, and I needed one more, and I did one swing through California, where it was right at the end, and I had pitched 1,000 times, and it was just magical, right? Because you had all your boxes checked, and and we swept in one last investor. So I do think that process of raising money is difficult, and getting it from multiple sources. But at the end of the day, you're better able to use that capital once you get it if you have to work hard for it.
Not all money is the same, and while we're not going to cover term sheets in this panel, there is this concept about what smart money really is. And I think it'd be very helpful to get your opinions on what you consider smart money and some guidelines for, if you are fortunate to have a number of investors at the table, what are some of the criteria that you use to figure out the ones that are right for your business?
I think for my line of business, small molecule drug discovery and development, it's very important to have the quote-unquote smart money in the sense that both our co-lead investors are life science-focused venture firms here in the United States, and the two partners both have been actually operational executives in big pharma before and running companies before they became investors. So they actually really know what it's like to run companies on the R&D side, the commercial side, licensing side, or even selling the companies. And they have a lot of networks and relationships that's really helpful. And then in addition, we have a strategic investment out of China. And since we have a significant China component in our business model, then it's important to have sort of, even though it's a smaller amount coming out of China, as well as coming out of our strategic partner, that is Shang Pharma, the CRO that's providing services for us, since we didn't have any R&D labs internally, either in the United States or in China. So I guess in a way, we never really considered quote-unquote dumb money because we didn't know. And frankly, that's because I didn't know how to go about finding dumb money. I only knew that one could actually raise money from life science-focused VCs, and these are the firms that invest in the pharmaceutical or pharmaceutical or biopharmaceutical space, and that's how we went about doing it. But looking back in terms of how Lead was able to exit by acquisition by Biomedical in 2002, that was truly due to one of our board members' relationships to getting to know the people at Biomedical and so on. And of course, our CSO's former working relationship with the CMO there, that they knew each other, and that's how we got connected. Of course, eventually, the products have to sell, of course, but knowing these people and having these relationships, having these trusts, and having these networks, I think that's very important for a company's success in this space.
Excellent. Geoff.
Okay. So I think there's two types of smart money, and one that gets really overlooked, especially in digital health, but I think across life sciences and across the market, is actually all of the sources of non-dilutive funding. And people don't put enough effort into all of the grant money and opportunities that are out there. You mentioned it in your fundraising cycle, and I thought that was brilliant, and I certainly want to applaud that. But from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation all the way through to SBIRs and everything else, there's just a lot out there. And it's worth, as long as it is not taking you out of your focus, it is silly not to spend a lot of time out there looking at that non-dilutive funding. It's certainly one of the reasons that Rock Health doesn't take a percentage as part of the way that we work. It is non-dilutive funding because we believe there's a lot of strength in that and a lot of good in trying to build up a company in that space. On the dilutive funding side, I think it's really hard to know. You should interview people that have been invested in by the people you're trying to get money from to try to get a picture of their smart money. But I will tell you, and that bug, that some of the people that made the biggest difference in our company, I wouldn't have known at the time. And I'm speaking, I don't think she's here. If she is, I'm going to embarrass her. But Lisa Sunan and the team at Silos was our lead investor. And I couldn't tell you at the time that was smart money. It was the smartest money we got because she and that team believed in us. And when the bubble burst and everything else in the portfolio went away, they still stood by us. And frankly, I was in my 20s and pretty dumb and didn't know what the heck I was doing. And they put a tremendous amount of effort into this beyond writing a check. So if you can figure out who the people are that are going to put that value in that's much bigger than just writing a check, but are actually passionate about both you as an entrepreneur and the problem you're trying to solve, sometimes that can be really hard to figure out. But if you're not at least understanding who else is in that portfolio and reaching out and talking to them, you're doing yourself a disservice. So between non-dilutive and actually spending the time in where your money's coming from, just like you would bringing in an employee. Nobody doesn't do background checks. Nobody doesn't try to look at LinkedIn. Nobody doesn't try to look at who else your employees are, where they've come from and what they've done. Why wouldn't you do the same with your capital?
Makes sense. I'd imagine there are a lot of questions in the audience, but we'd like to give you the opportunity to ask questions directly to our panelists, and Dominique will be coming around with microphones. So if any of you have questions for our panelists, please stand up and or raise your hand.
And please
we'll get as many as we can.
Please hold the fundraising questions for later today. We're going to talk a lot about it. So.
Hi. Hello? Yeah, a question. So you've got your founder and maybe a few close friends that have been helping you out, but then you get that magical mentor who's just been helping and helping. As Doug Crawford likes to say, they've tasted the Kool-Aid and they want more. And you want to bring them into the company. How do you figure out what percentage to give them? I mean, I know it's greed and ego kind of plays a role there, but what's the appropriate way to engage someone who's just to step beyond being a founder, who's just that next person who's really a mentor, but also an employee who you look up to, and they're critical for the company, but not yet a founder? Thank you.
So ironically, yesterday on the Rock Health blog, I wrote a long thing about advisors and valuing them and things like that. So I'll try to paraphrase what was way too long of a blog post about it. But so I think there's a very big difference in the way that you described it in terms of mentors and people that are potentially going to be employees. You know, the mentors, if you have to set up a framework for those mentors to actually deliver value and figure out how much value that's worth. And the biggest mistake I see, so I'm only going to give you a framework. I'm not going to give you an answer like 0.001% or something like that, because you need to figure that out. And you're the CEO, and you'll know how to do that. But I think the thing to think about is think about the comparables, right? This person, if they're truly a mentor, now you talked about whether they're bringing them as an employee, that's a different kind of thing. But if they're truly playing a mentor and advisory role, maybe they're spending 3 or 4 hours a month, maybe a week, even so, they're not anywhere close to the employees that you've brought in. And no matter how much experience is and how much those things in, your team has to be first. So think about just the comparables. Think about like real estate, in that, am I paying my mentor in equity? Are they more incentivized than actually my key employees? I see a lot of people make that mistake. The other thing is when mentors start asking for percentages, I mean, anything over 1%, anything over 0.5%, you have to ask yourself really hard, where is that value coming from? Because you actually can figure out how much that's worth once you start pricing your rounds. That's a lot of value that you're giving away in your company. Do not give away bits and pieces of your company, which most mentor relationships end up with access to someone's Rolodex, if anyone actually has a Rolodex anymore, but their address book, and address that and a few introductions. That's not worth 0.5% of your company. It's just not.
I'm curious, which of you actually built advisory boards versus had individual advisors? Avi or Nick?
Yeah, we built an advisory board, and it's mostly surgeons. And just a quick answer to that is, when we look at economically what this deal might be worth in the future, you can look at how much this surgeon might make, and for the time they're putting in, are they getting an hourly rate that's anywhere commensurate with a standard surgeon consultant, for example? You can kind of back into it that way, because, for example, if it's like they've been a great mentor, and at the end of the day, hey, here's your $1,000 for 3 years of work, you're not going to feel great. So to kind of balance the two.
We've got a question in the back.
Hi, Matt Landry with Biomatters. And I guess kind of following on to that, I was wondering if you had any comments on how you would actually go about building such an advisory board, or maybe even similarly bringing a CSO on.
So we built an advisory board, and I assembled it as the CEO, CSO. One of the great things about starting a company yourself is that it's easier to bring on other team members because you know all the jobs well because you're doing them. And so it's easier to pick people because you know kind of what the job requires. Even though you're not doing it as well as you could, you're doing part of it. So we identified who the key opinion leaders are. I think the best thing for truly the magic of a scientific advisory board is not so much in having them tell you what the literature says or what the clinical situation says, because you should really know that. One of the key things, frankly, was that when you get a venture capital or a private equity group that has a lot of interest in financing your company, one of the first things they'll ask you when they're really serious is, do you have a list of KOLs, key opinion leaders, that we could talk to who understand your technology and can tell us, they're advisors to the company but separate for the company, that we can talk with about their clinical practice or their research and how they perceive you. And those calls were magical for us because we educated our scientific advisory board members, and they provided some education back to us, and then they became key advocates for us on calls independent of us. For example, our target is elastin for our first company. Our drug target was elastin, so we went out and recruited really one of the top 3 experts in the entire world on this particular esoteric area of biology. And when the safety issues came up right before the Series A investment, that person was able to say, look, I'm a fully endowed professor at a major medical center. I've spent 30 years studying this molecule. I'm the founding president of the International Society of Matrix Biology, and I understand what they're doing, and I think in the end this will be safe and effective. That was worth way more than we could ever pay that person. He didn't say it because we gave him equity. He said it because he believed it. But we did pay for his time, and we gave him over 5 years 20,000 shares of stock, which will amount to about $100,000, when all's said and done. So I thought that was fair, and he thought it was really interesting what we were doing. I think that's another underestimated way of attracting a scientific advisory board. People will come just because they're really interested in what you're doing. If they're not really interested and the first thing they want is equity, I don't think they'll be great advisors.
That's fair. We've got a question over here.
Hi. Thanks. So Alan May, so sometimes founders are not CEOs. And you have the team, you have the IP, you have the clinical need, but the problem actually is the founder wants to be the CEO. How do you handle those situations, and how do you get through to a CEO that has, or to a founder who has a really good idea and a potentially winning technology? The problem is they want to be the CEO and try to get it financed and to run it.
Who would like to take that one?
Well, I would say I'm the founder of Therapeutics, and I was not a CEO. And in fact, when I said greed and ego kill companies, that's exactly what I meant, in the sense that the 3 people I recruited as my co-founders, actually, no, there are 4 people, because the 4th one actually came out later when we already had this co-founding team. So their combined experience is 20 years. So in terms of pharmaceutical experience. So you can imagine their age by comparison to me. So I would say it's one of those things that one, especially in a experience-heavy field like life science, where you deal with regulatory and your eventual customers are not even the end. They are basically pharmaceutical companies. Since our exit was via M&A. It really is something very hard for most entrepreneurs to take, because I've seen many people who came up to me and said, I have this great idea. I don't want to work for my own company anymore because I have the best idea. They screwed up everything. These venture investors have screwed up the company. We raised $60 million, now it's worth nothing. If only I can do it myself, then I will make it much better. And then I will hear these stories. I would say it doesn't really mean I agree with my own investors 100%, but I truly appreciate the value they added and their experience they brought to the table. It's not an easy thing to stomach, so that's why it's always important to remember greed and ego kill companies. Would you like to be the CEO of a company that eventually goes belly up and own 100% of it, or would you rather own like just a few percentage of a company that eventually was considered a success and you are actually a key founder of the team? So that's not really something that's easily teachable. You either embrace that and you basically say, okay, I accept that and I go with it, or you can't. And a lot of people I realize can't do that, because after all, it is their own baby. And I completely understand that feeling. It is your baby. You lived and breathed through this company. You think about the company every day. And how can you not be the head of the company? But I think, you deal with it. That's what I meant by the having 2 seemingly opposing thoughts at the same time still be able to function. You have complete passion for it, and yet you have to remain emotionless about certain things.
Yep. There's a question.
Last question, Jay.
Yeah, just thank you so much for all of your information. I'm learning so much. My name is Jay Mung, by the way. I sort of riffing off the idea of keeping 2 opposing thoughts simultaneously. One thing that I've sort of been struggling with is the pivot and sort of embracing when the balance between really being a real cheerleader for an idea versus, okay, now this is a bad idea. We should change things and take this on a whole different direction. And I think Geoff, you had mentioned pitching at a hospital and sort of realizing that was a bad idea and then changing in the end. But could you provide a little more insight on the process of how you evolves, how your ideas evolves?
Sure. Kind of like the last question, everyone's a CEO, everyone's an advisor, everyone says the word pivot, right? So there's kind of this whole nomenclature that has infected the Bay Area. So I think the biggest thing with pivot in particular, whenever somebody comes to me, and I get it a lot, I'll be very honest, I get a lot of, hey, we're going to pivot, or we need to pivot, or let's talk about basketball because I want to pivot. It's just pivot, pivot, pivot. 99% of the time it's just fatigue, right? It's actually just fatigue. And a difference between what a real pivot is and just being exhausted by the process and the minor changes that you go through in your business strategy, there are very few real pivots, I would say. There are people who, hey, that idea was horrible, let's go do another one, just try to keep the same funding and branding, right? And then there is, hey, we've got this great idea and we're still trying to figure out the product market fit, right? That's a different thing. And so I think the biggest thing that I try to do with entrepreneurs, and you use the word cheerleading, and there's a few people in the room that's what I've done with them, which is they've got something great. They're just tired. They're just exhausted. And they feel like there's an easier path, and they want to pivot towards that easier path. Don't let pivot become the word for easy, right? I mean, and because there's a lot of brilliant people in this room, and I've been lucky to work with a lot of them. And the big part of it is just sometimes just keeping your spirits high enough to understand that pivot is just an excuse for the long road that you're on as an entrepreneur. So that's the question I would ask yourself is, am I just exhausted? Does that look easier so I would just want to go that direction? Do I really not have a business here? And try to drive it with data. I mean, I'm a total religious convert. I've had the book since it came out about the business model canvas. And like that kind of structure that you saw earlier this morning, to understand what your metrics are, to understand what's vanity metrics versus real metrics, to know how to go forward through this, let data and information drive that, not the emotional exhaustion of, hey, that road looks easier, let's pivot.
Great. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.